Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for joining our program today. Israel is We, Jewish Americans Navigating the World with a New Nation State, presented by Dr. Miriam Mora. My name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director of the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I will be your moderator today. The Jewish Heritage Center collects, preserves, and illuminates the Jewish history of New England and beyond. We are an archive and educational center located in Boston at America's founding genealogical organization, New England Historic Genealogical Society, also known as American Ancestors. Today, we will learn from Dr. Mora about the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and how that impacted American Jewish life and identity thereafter. This is the third in a series of presentations that Dr. Mora has given this spring about Jewish life and acculturation in America in the first half of the 20th century. Before I introduce Dr. Mora, I'd like to make a couple of notes about this webinar. You in the audience will be muted and off camera throughout, but we'd love to hear from you during the question and answer period. So if you have questions during or after Dr. Mora's talk, please type them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to answer as many as we can following the presentation. Also, as we are broadcasting from different locations today, we hope you'll bear with us if we experience any technical difficulties. If you miss anything because of issues on your end or on ours, you will receive a link to the full recording of this session to watch later. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our featured speaker today, Dr. Miriam Mora. She is the inaugural historian in residence at the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center, a position generously funded by supporter Richard Schilder. She is also the Director of Academic and Public Programs at the Center for Jewish History in New York. Dr. Mora has a doctorate in immigration and ethnic history, specializing in Jewish American acculturation, ethnicity, and gender. She's published several articles in anthology chapters, and her forthcoming book, Carrying a Big Shtick, American Jewish Acculturation and Masculinity in the 20th Century, has just won the Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award from the Association for Jewish Studies, and it will be released by Wayne State University Press later this year. Dr. Mora has brought scholarly insight and analysis to the history in the Jewish Heritage Center's archives, and it has been such a pleasure to work with her and to learn from her. So without further ado, welcome Miriam Mora.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the introduction, and thank you to the Jewish Heritage Center for the opportunity to speak with all of you today and for all of the access to the archives that I've been granted this year, which has been really tremendous. I'm going to start today off with an apology. I'm under the weather, and rather than cancel, I decided to subject all of you to my intermittent coughing fits. But I assure you I medicated as much as I possibly could to undermine the cold, and will hope for the best. But I will try and mute if I go into a coughing fit so you don't have to hear me so much. I also hope that anyone who's watching who has an interest in Jewish history and the Jewish communities of New England will check out the incredible amount of online accessible holdings through the Jewish Heritage Center, which is really a treasure trove and wonderfully accessible resource, including some collections that are pertinent to the topic we're discussing this afternoon. And the staff is incredibly wonderful and helpful. So I urge you all to take advantage of this great community resource. Today, I'm going to be talking about the influence of Zionism, its progress, and eventually the State of Israel on American Jewish self-image and identity. I will not be bringing us all the way up to the present, as there's certainly not enough time for that, but I do hope to give you an idea of several of the major turning points in this history, which could have, in different circumstances, turned this into a very different lecture. Looking back, we have a tendency to see historical trajectories as inevitable, especially examining things that seem like more of a reflection of events than actual events in themselves. And since we're looking at the cultural effects of one nation on another, It's easy to see it as evidence of historical change more than as the cause of it. But here, I'm going to ask you to consider the reflection of Israel in America, not only as evidence of change, but also as a motivating factor for American Jewish feelings about Israel over time. Apologies. All right. Zionism and support for a political Jewish state was never a foregone conclusion anywhere in the diaspora, but least of all in the United States. American Jews had come closer to full and equal citizenship and social mobility than they had anywhere in Europe, and had a really strong sense of American nationalism and loyalty. For this reason, American Jews in the early 20th century varied in their feelings towards the Zionist idea. Leadership was torn. Some identified with the Zionist movement as one of redemption for the Jewish people and saw the Zionist project as kindred with American ideals and nationalism, and so embraced Zionism while defending their status as loyal Americans. Others believed that if American Jews joined the ranks of Zionists around the world, they would be forfeiting their hard-won acceptance in American society, claiming an identity which paralleled American nationalism, but was incompatible with it. There was no American Jewish consensus, of course, there never is. And even among those who did consider themselves Zionists, Jews created both cooperative and contradictory Zionist organizations to promote their various interpretations of that ideology. The attitudes of Jewish Americans towards Zionism, therefore, followed several nonlinear and weaving paths. There are a few large and traceable shifts and events that we could highlight as significant turning points in Jewish American Zionism. And in this lecture, I'm going to discuss the debates among Jewish leadership about the Zionist project and the influence that Jews in Palestine exercised on the American Jewish self-image. And I'm going to highlight a few of those turning points. Regardless of their support for or opposition to Jewish statehood, the developing Jewish community in late 19th and early 20th century Palestine affected Jewish Americans and their self-image, their sense of self. It gave them a contemporary Jewish national image that they could be proud of and provided American Jews with something innate to other American immigrant communities, an external land that they could include in their own American immigrant mythologies, making it acceptable, at least to many, to be American patriots while also supporting the foundation of a Jewish religious state. Of course, Jews in America already had much to be proud of, but there were elements of American society, arguably there still are, which remain exclusive, if not by overt restrictions, then by implicit biases and practices. One of the persistently elusive areas is the absence of American national leaders and military heroes. A Jewish nation manifesting in Palestine implicitly promised Jews their own nation with its own heroes, which is no small thing. And the first of these heroes was more of a type than an individual. It was the Zionist pioneer farmer. Some American Jews saw Jewish pioneers, chalutzim plural or chalutz singular, as akin to themselves, not only as heroes of a rejuvenated Jewish people, but also as a people whose ideals were related to American principles of pioneering, progress, and self-reliance. And this is demonstrated well in American Jewish school books. When Zionism made its way into these books during the interwar period, they adopted an interesting sort of reverence of the chalutz, which reflected the early writings of Americans who had visited Jewish settlements of the Yishuv. That's the name for pre-state Jewish settlement in Palestine. The image of Jewish farmers making the desert bloom strongly counteracted anti-Semitic projections of Jews as overly urbanized and unable to connect to the land, which were prevalent in America at the time. So the chalutz allowed American Jews to identify the Jewish people with contemporary popular American cowboy fantasies. For this reason, authors of American Jewish school books in the 1920s began to tell the story of Palestine as one of brave frontiersmen, mimicking the American West. The primary difference in representation between the chalutz and the American frontiersman was that the scout on the Western frontier had always been a solitary hero, and American ideals had valorized that rugged individualism. In Palestine, as they depicted it to American children, Jews were working in cooperation, looking out for one another and the collective. This difference reflects a combination of Jewish and American influences and ideals. The Jewish culture has long emphasized the well-being of the collective, the survival of the Jewish people, and the importance of social responsibility, both in the Jewish community and in larger society. And by emphasizing the collective, Jewish school books were able to highlight the Jewishness of the frontiersmen without many of the dominant negative Jewish tropes, instead embracing these socialist principles which were so prominent in the issue. American Jewish leaders and rabbis never uniformly believed that Zionism provided the best possible solution to Jewish problems in the modern world. However, it does seem to be a consistent attitude among Jewish Americans that regardless of the advisability of a Jewish state, the work being done in the Yishuv in the early 20th century provided an effective remedy to the stereotype of Jews as physically weak, as victims to a meek nature, and unable or unwilling to work the land. You may ask why this physical accounting of American Jewish interest in Jewish bodies in Palestine is relevant. And it's relevant because in many ways, while non-Zionist Jews in America refuted the Zionist dream, they still touted this image of these new Jews doing labor. So they undermined their own commitment to non-Zionism or anti-Zionism, which are very different. And it was a significant factor, I think, in the turning tide for American Zionist support. The debate over the ideological principles of Jewish America, Zionist and Americanist, largely in opposition to one another, formed one of the great tensions of Jewish leadership in the first half of the 20th century. They held conferences, developed schisms, and tested loyalties in the debate over the coexistence of Zionism and Americanism. Some religious Jews opposed Zionism on theological grounds, while leaders in the Reform movement did so as defenders of a patriotic, universalist American Judaism. Rabbi Isaac Weiss, one of the leading Reform rabbis of the 19th century, was staunchly opposed to the Zionist idea, favoring more aggressive Americanization or assimilation in the terms of the time. He wrote that, quote, "The Jew must become an American in order to gain the proud self-consciousness of the freeborn man," unquote. As an immigrant, he did so fervently and encouraged all Jewish immigrants to do the same. He said they should do so to become, quote, "not only American citizens, but to become Americans through and through outside of the synagogue," unquote. Following in his ideological footsteps, Rabbi David Phillipson, a member of the first graduating class from Hebrew Union College in 1883 and founder of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the CCAR, in 1889, he's pictured here in the photo on the left, on the far left, with the Van Dyke beard. He was a staunch advocate of Americanism and felt that Zionism flew in the face of the cause and the fight for Jewish acceptance in all aspects of American life and patriotism. In fact, he called Zionism neo-ghettoism and thought it was dangerously separatist. And the entire CCAR came out as against Zionism from the start of its political program. And at least Rabbi Phillipson believed that it would be a short-lived fad. Though most Reform Jewish leaders opposed Zionism at this point, many American Jews were dedicated Zionists. And a lot of non-Jewish American leaders were as well. In 1897, the Zionist Organization of America was founded, a gathering of various other smaller Zionist organizations and Jewish nationalist clubs that had all endorsed the first Zionist Congress that same year. Public support and opposition was a very complex issue, both within and outside of the Jewish American community. Many leading Jewish figures and those who looked to them for leadership in the Jewish community very clearly declared themselves as non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. But as the early decades of the 20th century passed, witnessing more Russian pogroms and revolutions and the lynching of Leo Frank and the effects of the Great War, many leaders in the Jewish community started changing their minds and drew closer, if not into, the Zionist fold, taking their followers with them. Support grew, for example, when popular figures joined the movement, such as Rabbi Solomon Schechter, who's here pictured next to Phillipson, And he joined the Zionist movement in 1905. Louis Brandeis did so in 1912. And, in addition, massive waves of joiners came at the historical moments which opened the door to tangible progress in the Zionist dream. A major shift in attitudes towards Zionism in America, for example, came as a response to the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issuing his famous declaration, which declared English support for the Zionist goal of establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration promised a national home, but did not guarantee statehood or independence to the Jewish people in Palestine. Its existence did, however, bring back disparate groups and leaders who had drawn away from Zionism. It even brought back other brands of territorialists, like Israel Zangwill, the playwright, who, in spite of his own contradictory views to Zionism, believed that any opposition to a Jewish home in Palestine would be treasonous to the Jewish people. The Allied powers' victory in the Great War, almost precisely a year after the Balfour Declaration, meant that control of Palestine was taken from the Ottoman Empire and transferred to Great Britain, who not only had voiced support for the idea of a Jewish homeland there, but during the war also supported, organized, and trained entirely Jewish battalions to fight against the Ottomans in that territory, the Jewish Legion, which you can see pictured here on the right. Or no, sorry, that's the Zionist Congress. I think I have them later. Many British leaders and soldiers like Balfour were millenarians. They supported the Jewish state for religious reasons connected to the manifestation of the second coming of Christ, much as American evangelicals do today. As you can imagine, suddenly, with the English controlling Palestine and having issued the declaration a year before, the possibility of a Jewish homeland being declared seemed far more likely, should England actually follow through on the implications of that declaration. And this helped in many ways to turn the tide of American support. And Jewish leaders who had previously opposed Zionism began to shift their positions. There were concessions and cooperation in the following decade between Zionist and non-Zionist leaders. For example, in 1927, the Weizmann-Marshall Agreement on the formation of the Jewish Agency connected both sides of Zionists and non-Zionists in supporting the migration and settlement of Jewish refugees to Palestine, if not the Zionist idea. The American Jewish Committee, with dominantly non-Zionist leadership, particularly the chairman of the executive committee, an outspoken non-Zionist, Cyrus Adler, who's also pictured on the left, second from the right, had long, hard debates about their stance after the declaration was released, the Balfour Declaration. The result was a resolution penned by Cyrus Adler with Louis Marshall, which tied non-Zionists more closely to the Zionist project than they had ever expected to be, by agreeing to support and cooperate with Jews who sought to establish a Jewish spiritual or cultural center in Palestine. And this language was promising to both non-Zionists and political Zionists. It promised a homeland for those who wished it, but in essence, they agreed that at a minimum, it would be a center of cultural and religious renaissance, even for those who shunned the political agenda. Even after understandings like this had been reached, acculturated American Jews fought to keep the public aware that Jews were not all Zionists and that not all American Jews believed that they should have national pride for any other nation than the United States. The Reform movement adopted a more positive attitude towards Zionism formally in 1937 at the convention of the CCAR, though the demographics of its leadership were quite different by then. In their Columbus platform of 37, the CCAR reversed its stance on the Jewish peoplehood, declaring, quote, "We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in Palestine's upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make it not only a haven of refuge for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish cultural and spiritual life." Anti-Zionists, like Rabbi Phillipson, continued to speak out against Zionism and to promote the idea that American Jews were American first, though their organizations were small until 1943, when they joined together to establish the Anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism. And the timing of the council's founding was pretty ominous, as Jews throughout Europe were being assaulted because they were a nation, a race in Nazi terminology. and American Jews were just starting to learn about the existence of Nazi death camps, and finding a safe haven for Europe's Jews seemed more urgent than ever. Meanwhile, as American Jews watched terrible news coming from Europe, the Jewish progress in Palestine, the Jewish inhabitants of the Yishuv, stood out as a beacon of hope for the Jewish people. The generations of Jews born in the ancestral homeland presented a new Jew, particularly welcome in light of this news coming from Europe, which showed Jews beaten down by oppression and largely defenseless. These new Jews came to be called Sabras, named for the thorny, prickly pear, because it had a harsh exterior but contained an inner sustenance and sweetness. This image and the polarization of American Jews in Europe and in Palestine is hugely significant, because it helps us to understand the emerging infatuation that American Jewry had with these Jews in Palestine. And Jews weren't the only Americans to form this romantic narrative around the rebuilding of the Jewish people in the desert. As American politicians and journalists became involved in the politics of Palestine, the image of heroic Chalutzim in the Yishuv began to solidify in the larger American imagination. And here I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit to demonstrate this effect. In an example of members of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which was a group of non-Jewish men from England and America who were tasked with deciding the political, or weighing in on the political fate of the land at the close of the Second World War. So these members toured Palestine, and when they got back, they recalled the kind of stark difference between these new Jews and the Arab inhabitants of the land as they passed from one territory to another. One member, an American attorney, explained that as soon as the train reached the Jewish settlements in Palestine, quote, "The tempo and color of life changes sharply. Things seem to quicken, to become more alive. Children suddenly were no longer tiny bundles of rags, but youngsters wearing shorts with sturdy arms and legs and open, smiling faces and bright eyes, alert and human again." In fact, unquote. In fact, he was so convinced of the evident physical rebuilding of the Jewish people by being on their ancestral homeland that he believed that not only were Jews in Palestine becoming stronger, but also taller and blonder and bluer-eyed as well. These reborn Palestinian Sabras, as well as resettled European Zionists, reached out to the American Jewish community for support, calling on them to join in the fight for Jewish survival, though they requested monetary support far more than they did fighting bodies. During the war, a branch of revisionist Zionists from Palestine sent delegates to the United States for the express purpose of garnering American support for the Jewish state and the creation of a Jewish army. They operated under several group titles, including the American League for a Free Palestine, ALFP, American Friends of a Jewish Palestine, the Committee for a Jewish Army of Stateless and Palestinian Jews, and the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe. In addition to having these many names for their organization, the leader, Hillel Kook, also adopted an American name, Peter Bergson, to give the mission a more American image and to appeal to Americans kind of as fellow American Jews, as kindred. Many Americans found the idea of Jews fighting, especially while the news from Europe was all of Jews being abused, incredibly attractive. The prospect of an internationally gathered all-Jewish army was not entirely novel. As I mentioned, the Jewish Legion, which I do have a picture here on the left, they fought under the command of the British during the First World War. And the proposed Jewish army was, in fact, being promoted by Zev Jabotinsky, the man behind the original Jewish Legion, who's pictured center here. As a Jewish soldier, Jabotinsky had also founded the Jewish Self-Defense Organization in Russia and eventually co-founded the Irgun in pre-state Palestine. American presses were covering very little about the destruction of European Jewry during the war, staying under the radar. The Committee for a Jewish Army, started by Bergson and other members of his group, on the other hand, were advertising to the American public, publishing full-page advertisements in the New York Times, and holding huge public events across New York City and across the country, and advocating this all-Jewish army in Palestine in the most dramatic possible ways. Once the American public had been informed of the mass murder of European Jews in November of 42, the Committee for a Jewish Army redoubled these publicity efforts with a full-page New York Times spread headed by this illustration of crop down on the right, in which a screaming Jewish soldier, half buried in a pile of murdered relatives, sheds a tear and holds his gun aloft. And the bodies include a mother and infant, an elderly woman, a man in chains, and an elderly bearded man wearing a Star of David armband, clutching a Torah, and with a swastika hilted knife in his back. Underneath the figure, the words, "We shall no longer witness with pity alone. All they ask," it continues, "is the right to fight and die, if need be, for democracy and the survival of their people. Though unwanted and unarmed, still they do not give up. They are awaiting the signal from America, the moral and military arsenal of world democracy," unquote. This call and what it reflects in all of Bergson and his group's attempts to appeal to American audiences is specifically targeting American nationalism and American Jewish nationalism. He employs this combination of appealing to their desire for Jewish heroism and guilting them and their nation over inaction to rescue the Jews of Europe. His various groups repeatedly claimed very publicly, especially when other American Jewish leaders, said that they didn't appreciate what Bergson and them were doing. They said, well, we're the only ones who are taking measurable action to actually help Jews overseas. And by the close of the war, excuse me, not all surviving European Jews wanted to build a new life for them in Palestine. So all the efforts to pull all these Jews to Palestine, it wasn't a universal desire. An unprecedented number did attempt the migration at the end of the war, supported in large part by the American Jewish Committee, thanks in part to the earlier agreements and resolutions discussed between Zionists and non-Zionists. And the attempts of survivors to reach the issue were yet legendarily difficult, as a lot of displaced Jews remained stuck in camps in Europe, and when they did begin the migration, were halted by British troops and turned away or even interned in one of the 12 British deportation camps on the island of Cyprus. While survivors attempted to make their way to mandatory Palestine, the political situation there was fraught, and the masses of victims were left largely at the mercy of the Allied powers. The Jews attempting to form the Jewish state could not have won the War for Independence, also known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, without a massive influx of men, material, and economic support from the Jewish diaspora, particularly America and Western Europe. The Machal, the Hebrew acronym for Overseas Volunteers, comprised volunteers from 56 different countries, mostly World War II veterans from various nations, many of whom hailed from the United States. Though Jews born in the Yishuv presented the image of ideal Israeli soldiers in this kind of international view, in truth, in the early years of the war, 80% of the military force was made up of newcomers who had been in Palestine for less than a year, and so made up a vital majority of Jewish fighters. Those Americans who went to Palestine to join the fight were unlikely to have been ardent Zionists before the war. Their motivation was far more personal and more in reaction to the Holocaust and the sight of displaced Jews being pulled off of ships headed for Palestine. They didn't come out of the woodwork to volunteer, but were recruited, targeted by the Irgun and the Haganah operatives in the United States, like Bergson, who reached out to Jewish war veterans. Overall, American Zionism manifested largely on paper, supporting the Israeli cause by sending money and weapons and lobbying. Americans, and not only Jews, saw in this fledgling state a modern recreation of their own mythical nation-making story, with heroic frontiersmen securing the land ordained to them by divine providence. And this connection for so many Americans allowed American Jews in many ways to support the state without the fears that they had had in the interwar years. Truly quite a different demographic of American Jews began supporting various Zionist endeavors as the war was being fought for statehood. Jewish American gangsters, for example, largely uninvolved with any organized American Jewry, vehemently supported the upbuilding of a fighting Israeli state. Jewish gangsters reveled in the idea of Jews taking up arms and fighting. When talking to an emissary from the Haganah, the main Zionist paramilitary organization in Palestine, Bugsy Siegel, the famous gangster, asked, "You mean to tell me that Jews are fighting like killing?" And when they assured him that righteous Jewish violence was indeed becoming a reality in Palestine, he began donating in large sums of cash, estimated at a total of $50,000. Similarly, the American League for a Free Palestine received a check from Meyer Lansky for $25,000 to support the cause. One of the most influential cultural events in drawing American Jews closer to Israel was the release of the novel and subsequent feature film Exodus by Jewish American novelist Leon Uris. And I have a picture here of the movie poster. The novel was based on the Exodus, one of the most famous ships that the British turned away, which carried 4,515 passengers, most of them Jewish refugees from Europe, and piloted by Palestinian Jews. The British forced the actual Exodus to turn around and return to Germany. But in Uris's account, the refugees earned safe passage through the tenacity of their Sabra leaders. Uris accomplished a tremendously influential feat with the publication of Exodus. He managed to redefine Zionism to an American audience by creating a tangible, accessible Zionist hero for Jewish and American audiences. The main character, an all-American hero, aside from the fact that he was a Palestinian Jew, Ari Ben Canaan, was described as big, handsome, hard, and possessing ice blue eyes. And the story of Jewish Palestine in this retelling was consistently in line with American principles and ideals. And by telling his story, by telling the story of the founding of Palestine through this very American lens, which I don't have time to go into a whole lot, but I'd be happy to talk about more in the Q&A, Uris helped to redefine the relationship between Israel and the United States for decades after, by Americanizing the story. By connecting American Jews comfortably to Israeli heroes, Uris helped to usher in this new element of American Jewish identity, pride in the Israeli as a representative of the Jewish people. Over the decades following the war, the international Jewish imagination began to focus on Israel as a part of international Jewish identity. Elements of American Jewish life and culture had begun to incorporate reflections of the fledgling state, primarily through that greatest of American pastimes, consumerism. By the time the Yom Kippur War, by the time the Six-Day War occurred in 1967, Israel had become a cultural touchstone in American Jewish life. Whereas in previous years, the American Jewish connection to the land was an ideological support or opposition to the Zionist ideal or non-Zionist acceptance of the land as a cultural spiritual center. It was now focused on life in Israel being incorporated into American Jewish identity, making a whole host of things with little or no background in religious practice seem somehow Jewish. Modern Israeli dance, art, music, clothing, jewelry, fashion, and of course tourism all began to make their way into synagogue community and home life. By 1950, just 2 years after the war was won, Israel greeted more than 30,000 visitors, twice as many as the year before. And in 58, the 10-year anniversary of Israel's establishment, a record total of 75,158 visited. And by 1966, 8 years later, the number had leapt to an estimated 300,000 visitors annually. Through these pilgrimages organized by American Jews and who were urged to visit, and all these people did go, no more than a third of American Jews actually made the journey themselves. But they came to know Israeli culture by adopting these elements of Israeli life that were brought back. And it's interesting to look at this particular swath of time that we have today, to go back to Cyrus Adler, such an ardent non-Zionist, and see how he came to accept that he could separate himself from the Zionist idea, political manifestations and struggle for statehood, and yet remain connected to the project by cultural affinity and admiration. He took pride in Jewish progress in Palestine without becoming a Zionist. In many ways, that's what a huge number of American Jews did after statehood was established. The last points that I'll make this evening are about the relationship between American Jews and Israel in 1967, hinging on the Six-Day War. Historians for decades claimed that American Jewish focus on the Holocaust and on Israel emerged as a reaction to the Six-Day War. But as we've already seen, the state of Israel was already significant in everyday lives of American Jews by the time the war happened. They had already begun incorporating Israeli folk dance and song, consumer culture, and household incorporation of Israeli imagery well before the war. The uptick in Israeli focus for American Jews after the war is still notable. American Jews in larger numbers began practicing Jewish life differently, adopting Israeli customs and even changing the way they pronounced Hebrew words to adopt a more Israeli sound, such as from yarmulke to kippah or Shabbos to Shabbat. Jewish youth groups, synagogues, and summer camps incorporated Israeli folk music and dancing more regularly. Having Israeli art and artifacts in the home became an important element of larger Jewish culture in the United States. In addition, this incorporation of Israeli life and culture into the lives of American Jews became more attainable and organic, with increasing waves of immigrants moving to the United States from Israel, which began immediately after statehood was declared, but rose dramatically in the early 70s. Hold on, sorry. Sorry about that. With these waves of Israeli immigrants, we also, the previously mentioned things like changing in pronunciation is largely because Israelis started teaching American Hebrew school. And so incorporated a lot more of this into Jewish American culture. So one of the defining features of this conflict for American Jews was the fear of another threatened destruction of the Jewish people. American Jewish concern for Israel was real, in spite of the controversy over who should bear responsibility for actually beginning the war. Israel had, after all, launched preemptive strikes against Egypt. And from the moment that war began, American Jews were so preoccupied with the events in the Middle East that an unprecedented uniformity of focus and panic affected American Jews from all walks of life and denominations. It may be the most unified American Jews have ever been in doing a single thing, just paying attention to the events in Israel while waiting for a resolution. In addition, it motivated, at least in part, an antagonistic Jewish American response. According to Lucy Davidovich, the following year, quote, "For the second time in a quarter of a century, the Jewish people were facing annihilation. But this time, somehow, things would be different. There would be no passivity, no timidity. That was the mood of American Jews," unquote. Jews in the United States had so incorporated this new image of tough Israelis that this now seemed possible, a great change from their perception during the Second World War. Their fear was quickly replaced with unprecedented pride in the Israeli state and Jewish strength as Israel vanquished its enemies with enough speed to shock the international community. Their military victory against Soviet-backed forces inspired further support for the new state from the American public, both Jewish and otherwise, which had already been pretty high before the war began. And again, American Jews took pride in the victory as both Americans and as Jews, as within that Cold War context, this was a clear victory for democracy. American Jewish financial contributions also escalated dramatically, especially considering the short duration of the war. In the short period from the outbreak of the war to its conclusion, 6 days, American Jews alone raised $100 million in support of the state. In addition to showing military strength, the war had religious meaning for global Jewry. Israel not only fought off enemies, but it also conquered territories like the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan Heights, and included land that was irreplaceably sacred to the Jewish religion, such as the holy sites of the Old City of Jerusalem. These successes had implications for the messianic as well as political Zionisms. At this time, Zionism in Israel turned towards the religious, overpowering the previously dominant secular Zionist forces, which had so defined the core of early Zionist settlement and philosophy that we started with at the beginning of today's lecture. Excuse me. However, the war affected Jews and Zionists in the United States very differently. In many ways, American Jews actually became less religious in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. At this point, Jewish life in America began to focus so intently on Israel that some contemporary commentators and critics were arguing that American Jews were beginning to value the Israeli state over the God of Israel and the religion of Israel. Even the anti-Zionist group, the American Council for Judaism, found themselves internally conflicted over the state of Israel and how to discuss it, getting into internal arguments over whether it was even appropriate for any Jew, even an anti-Zionist, to criticize Israel as an American Jew. Through Israeli soldiers, American Jews discovered this new pride in being Jewish, in the aura that radiated from Israeli toughness and ruggedness. This altered international Jewish image promoted two changes in the attitudes of American Jews, which reflect both their attitudes towards the state of Israel as a foreign nation and their own personal identity. They came to see Israel as a state capable of survival, one which even thrived in the initial decades of its existence. And young Jews saw Jewish strength and success, and for the first time in a century, perhaps, a diminished sense of urgency about Jewish survival. The Six-Day War also changed the way that American Jewish youth saw themselves as members of a religious and ethnic minority, perhaps even more than for their parents' generation. As one woman who was, she was in college at the time of the Six-Day War, so not even born until after statehood, she wrote, 2 weeks ago, Israel was they, now Israel is we. It's an interesting measure of difference between the determined creation of a state and the settled reality of Israel, that unlike the War of Independence, no Machal volunteers traveled to fight and bolster Israeli forces during the Six-Day War. There was no time to do so, right? 6 days. But even after, they didn't do so in any of the conflicts that followed. Though many American Jews have chosen to go to Israel to serve regardless of their intention of making Aliyah, either as immigrants in the Israeli Defense Forces or taking civilian jobs left vacant by soldiers during conflicts, the rush to do so for a specific conflict has never since occurred. And the numbers do remain quite small. But American Jews did at that time begin to migrate to Israel in larger numbers than they ever had. The numbers of American Olim, the new immigrants in Israel, increased tremendously in the years immediately following the Six-Day War. From 68 to 69, Jewish migration from America to Israel increased by over 40%, and then by an additional 17% by 1971. That increase wasn't permanent, it all but disappeared by 1973, and declined even further in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, but it does show this spike in connection, the need to actually go to be a part of it. This volunteerism shows a somewhat conflicted young Jewish America, because as many young Jews were on the political left, they had formed a decidedly negative view of war in the years preceding the Six-Day War, based on the American example in Vietnam. A lot of anti-war Jewish protesters in the late 60s wrote about their discomfort with their positions as generally as supporters of third world liberation and their lack of clarity about the rightness and wrongness of the Israeli state vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. And a lot of them had major falling outs, both on a personal and a organizational level, with their Black comrades who took a decidedly anti-Israel stance in the late 60s, pushing Jews often to become more ardent Zionists themselves as they felt disconnected from the other movements which they had been so dedicated to before. The reason for this inner conflict was more than political. The war in Israel felt personal for American Jews because of their coming of age with the cultural influences of Israel helping to define their Jewishness in the United States. And this wasn't merely a Jewish view, but a largely American one. According to survey data from the Pew Research Center, for 40 years following the war, Americans were primarily sympathetic to Israel rather than to Arab states or Palestinians, and more so than any other nation outside of the conflict. Of course, this doesn't bring us up to the present, nor should it. A great deal has happened since, which has strengthened the bonds of some American Jews to Israel and severed others. New and strengthened connections between the state and other religious groups, particularly American evangelicals, have both guided and followed new directions of Israeli progress. But for the purposes of this talk and this, hopefully conversation, looking at how American Jews and the American Jewish community moved from a conflicted and uncomfortable relationship with Zionism to where it stood in 1968, it's incredible that this transformation occurred. American Jewish schools, synagogues, and Jewish cultural centers were draped with Israeli flags less than a month ago, and many still are for Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, and this one particularly being the 75th. Hamzas hang in Jewish homes, and Judaica stores sell Jewish and Israeli goods of all kinds all over this country, the United States. And it's cultural, but it's also blended into the American Jewish religion, as those Judaica stores are so often located in and run by synagogues. And though we aren't here to talk about the present, and as a historian, I'm generally loath to do so, the cultural incorporation of Israel into Jewish life and Jewish American sense of self can be seen as a tool for understanding some of the complexities of American Jewish youth's relationship to and understanding of the state and the concept of Israel. And with that, I'll hand it back to Rachel, and we'll have our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that really rich and full and timely talk. Before we get to the Q&A, and just a reminder to our audience that please type in your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But before we get there, I did just want to mention that you can watch Dr. Mora's previous two talks, first about the American Jewish experience between the world wars, and also about anti-Semitism in the military and on the home front during World War II. You can watch those on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org/video library. And there are all sorts of other wonderful programs there as well to peruse. I also want to note two upcoming programs. Next week, my colleague and American Ancestors, James Heffernan, gives a talk about getting started in Lithuanian family history research. That is next week. And I'm also very excited to share that next year, the Jewish Heritage Center is hosting a tour, Jewels of the Baltics, to Latvia and Lithuania, with an optional extension to Estonia. And you can learn more and sign up to be on an interest list at our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. So let us turn to your questions. Miriam, I was hoping first that you could just mention a little bit more about I was fascinated by that scenario of the Sabras coming to the States to try to lobby to raise a Jewish army during the war. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the reception to that and how that effort aligned or didn't align with what American Zionist groups were advocating and working on themselves.
Certainly. Yeah. So thank you for the question. It's a great one. The Bergson and his group, and there is an interesting book that came out number of years ago called the Bergson Boys, if anyone has interest in that particular story. But his group is very interesting because it's interesting that they changed their names to sound more American and then take such very un-American tactics. For the most part, the Jewish American organizations during the war were trying not to be too loud, trying not to lobby too hard. This, it changed in 1942 when people really became aware of what was going on. But, the trust in Roosevelt was tremendous, right? The assumption that if terrible things were happening, the American government would do the right thing, kind of led a lot of Jewish organizations. So they weren't nearly as aggressive. And when Peter Bergson, Hillel Kook, and his people and organizations started this aggressive lobbying campaign and using really harsh language, showing dead bodies in these in the illustrations, and they partnered with Ben Hecht, the playwright and screenwriter, who wrote a couple of major pageants that they put on. One was called We Will Never Die, and one, A Flag is Born. And these pageants showed, this really stark contrast between the strength coming out of Israel and Palestinian Jews and the tremendous weakness of the diaspora. And one of them, the pageant We Will Never Die, which was hugely popular. They filled Madison Square Garden. There are pictures of Eleanor Roosevelt in attendance. And there was a part where they, targeted the audience and said, you American Jews, you are failing to do your part. And you American lawmakers, you're failing to do your part. And Stephen Weiss and all these leading, Jewish rabbis and leaders in America were horrified, and really did not like what these groups were doing. But what was really interesting was that they were using the voice, the language of America. In all of these ads, it said, they were topped with things like, we are speaking of American democracy, or we're speaking of the ideals of American, American democracy and nation building, and all of these things to try and draw from Americans the support that they thought they should be giving. And they even chose as spokespeople, I think their biggest spokesperson was Guy Gillette, who was a senator from Iowa, a non-Jewish senator. But they were trying to get people to, to show this direct connection that building the nation of Israel was like building the nation of the United States. So it's very different, very interesting.
Thank you. You talked a lot about the romanticization, and the sort of the front first with the frontier character, the cowboy, sort of superimposing American, archetypes onto, first Palestinians, and then Israelis. And then it kind of seems to flip, and now we're adopting, rather than superimposing our American types, now we're adopting Israeli types, and finding a lot of power and romance in that too. Is there, we're some generations removed. Does that flip again? Or do we, have Americans sort of started to see, and also this idea that you mentioned of, they versus we, and has the we become they again at any point? Like, have we allowed Israelis to sort of be their own people, instead of these sort of personalities that we're imposing on either adopting or imposing?
So I feel like there are a few questions in
yes,
there.
yes,
some really interesting ones. The first point you make of the kind of flip of projection from one side to the other, I think is a really good one. There was excuse me, there was some of my favorite articles that I found from pre-statehood, from the interwar period, referred to the Shomrim, the guards of settlements, Jewish settlements in Palestine, as the Minutemen. which is like as American foundational as you can get. But now, when you talk about, the strongest fighters, and I mean, there are little Krav Maga studios all over New York City, where I live, because there's no one tougher than a Mossad agent. That has become like this in film and television. It's more than the Minutemen. It's this current manifestation of like the super soldier. So yeah, I think that absolutely flipped. It's very interesting ways, especially observable in pop culture. As far as the they and we, I think it's less than it's redisconnected, that it became connected after the 67 war. And I don't think it disconnected. I think so much has changed. Obviously, there are American Jews, just like in the early 20th century, when Jews who were not Zionists, whether they were anti-Zionist or just statedly non-Zionist, they were constantly trying to reinforce the idea to their countrymen that Zionism and Judaism were not the same thing. That you could be Jews and you could be Zionist or non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, but that they were political and they were disconnected. And I feel like that argument still takes place, where it is still very much in it. I mean, I think we see it on college campuses, we see it all over the country, people engaging in the same discussion. But I think what's maybe more interesting even is that we hasn't gone away, it's shifted to different demographics. So for example, some of the most ardent financial supporters in America and political supporters of the state of Israel are evangelicals. So, the core of American support has shifted. And of course, there are strongholds of American Jews who are Israeli nationalists or Zionists or both. But there's also this huge rising evangelical support. So, I mean, I think most of the people now, and this is, it's contemporary, so it's not as historical, it's more conjecture or observation, but I do think that, if you were to do a count of the people who would say Israel is we, I think the bulk of them would be, just by sheer numerical division, not Jewish. There are a lot more of them than there are of us.
Fascinating. You mentioned college campuses, so I also wanted to just return to, you mentioned this tension of young people around the 67 war who saw this cause that they believed in and they wanted to fight for. At the same time, I think you were saying that they were also protesting the Vietnam War. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, in my research and my upcoming book is on Jewish masculinity, so that's where my focus really was. And I was looking at Jews in the anti-war and countercultural movements of the 60s. And what I found was, especially in Jewish student newspapers on college campuses, it was leading up to, during, and after the 6-Day War, Jews were incredibly conflicted because they had felt so kindred in their struggle with their African American classmates and fellow protesters. They were protesting against the war in Vietnam. They were protesting against the draft. They were protesting against, there were feminist protests, and they had lots of things that they were unified in. So this is both men and women. And then, and they're all unified in the support of third world movements, to decolonize. That was kind of a big part of their anti-war stance and anti-imperialism stance. And so then, when the African American community who's involved in the civil rights movement and the protest movement says Israel is an oppressive government, a lot of Jewish students are suddenly incredibly conflicted because, a lot of them are, especially in this age, in this moment, they have survivors in their family, they have Israelis in their family, maybe they've migrated, maybe they've visited, and they've incorporated it into their sense of self, and they still see Israel as a vulnerable place, a vulnerable people who are victims. So it's really hard to choose where they land on this because they have these stated political ideals and they can't decide. I have a quote here from one of my favorite of these student papers, which I'll read. And it's the end of a kind of long article about this internal struggle. This student at City College in New York wrote, "The Arab-Israeli war has had a schizoid effect on my emotions. On the one hand, I find war and its inherent loss of life revolting, and I could not and would not participate. On the other hand, I realize that Israel has been struggling for its existence while surrounded by hostile neighbors bent on her destruction, and I sympathize with Israel. The net result is that I sit home alone and curse war and curse the Arabs." So he's very conflicted and just can't figure out where to land. And a lot of those students move laterally into Zionist organizations, and a lot of them leave Zionism entirely. They decide that their allegiances lie elsewhere, but most of them, I mean, some obviously can find their way between supporting the two. But the main problem is that the civil rights movement rejects Zionism. They recognize it as SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, puts out a statement after the Six-Day War, which calls Israel an oppressive, a racially oppressive government. And then they make clear, they reiterate their stance. They say, we are not apologizing because of the Jewish backlash, but we do recognize that Zionism and Judaism are different. And that was their kind of, that's where they landed. So it was a tough place for American Jewish protesters to be.
Well, perhaps that we are at the hour, and perhaps that's a good place. There's so much more we could discuss, but perhaps that's a good place to end, because there will always be conflicted feelings. We're certainly seeing a lot of tension and disagreement in this country and around the world. But no matter where you land or how you sort of think about these issues, it's so helpful to know this history, to have the context and the background and the understanding of the threads that sort of led to the formation of Israel, and its its influence on American Jewry. So this has been really, really terrific, and I want to thank you certainly for soldiering through your cold, Miriam, and for taking this hour to educate us. So well, I do want to thank everyone in the audience as well for joining us today. I hope that as you leave this webinar, you'll be asked to take a very, very brief survey, which helps us to develop further programming. So we hope that you will fill that out. I also want to invite everyone to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center. Again, our website is jewishheritagecenter.org. And I'd like to mention that this free program was made possible by contributions to the Jewish Heritage Center and to American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, from people all over the world. So we hope that you might consider a donation of your own to support our educational and archival work. Thank you. We hope that you will join us again and that you have a lovely spring season in the meantime. Goodbye until then.